I will just talk a little bit about remote education and blended learning. And when we're recording this, we are about to publish very extensive advice and guidance on remote education and blended learning, which will be on our website very shortly. So I would strongly recommend those of you watching this video to refer to that guidance when it is published, because one of the things we know about remote education and blended learning, from the feedback that we've received from members right across the UK, is that it's very complex and it raises an awful lot of questions. And we want to make sure that our advice and guidance addresses all of those questions. So in terms of the feedback that we've received, published advice and guidance that we will put on the website very shortly addresses all the issues, many issues that members have raised with us over the past weeks and months. What I'm going to do this evening is just talk about some of the key issues that are raised by teachers and school leaders on remote education and blended learning. So I won't go through the full detail of our advice and guidance. That will be there for you. But hopefully this presentation will touch on some of the most frequently recurring issues that teachers and school leaders right across the UK raise about these really important issues. So what we'll do is talk, first of all, and I think it's important we get our terms defined clearly. What do we mean when we talk about remote education and blended learning? And then touch on some of the problems and some of the issues that can arise when schools are developing and then implementing their remote education and blended learning offers. And then also think about how those problems and how those issues might best be addressed. Hopefully that will be of benefit to those watching this video. So just to set a bit of context around this to begin with, is we know that because of the impact that COVID-19 is continuing to have on schools right across the UK, there is an expectation that there will be some form of remote education and blended learning made available to students. And that varies, that expectation varies to some extent across the UK, but in one form or another, all schools across the UK are developing and implementing remote and blended learning offers. In England, there is a direction to schools, so a legal requirement to make remote learning offers available to pupils when they're not able to attend school, when they have to self-isolate, or if there's an outbreak in a school that can't attend on site for whatever reason. And we know that COVID-19 is likely to be with us in one form or another for some months to come. So remote and blended learning will be something that schools are thinking about and seeking to address for some months to come. And it's very clear that the overwhelming feedback from our members is that the importance of continuity of learning when on-site education is disrupted, it's very difficult to find anyone who would dispute the importance of that. Education is vital, and it's important that the education system makes a learning offer available to pupils when they're not able to attend school. That seems a pretty clear consensus across the system. We also know, as we've said, that trying to implement those offers does create a range of issues that cause legitimate concern for teachers and school leaders. So it's our job as your union to understand those issues, give you the advice, the guidance, support and representation that you need in order to address those properly, make sure that remote and blended learning is made available to pupils in the best possible way. The circumstances are difficult and everyone acknowledges that, but there are some ways of going about remote and blended learning that are better than others. We'll look at some of those this evening. So let's think about what we mean when we talk about remote and blended learning. If we talk about remote education, that can mean several things, but essentially it often means pupils being taught remotely in their home. So think about the early stages of the pandemic and the remote education offers that schools had to develop very quickly, essentially it was pupils, pretty much all pupils, being taught remotely while they were in their homes. And that obviously continues to be an important part of schools' remote education offers. But it can also mean, and it can also be defined as a teacher who is at home and is teaching pupils who are in school from their own home. So the teacher might be self-isolating, maybe not able to attend the school site. The pupils are on site. So what you see increasingly as common practice is the teacher at home conducting remote education to pupils who are at school. Another key point to draw out right at the outset is that remote education can be online. That could use Zoom, like we're using here. It also involves physical resources, and I'll touch on that a little later on. And then you hear people talk about blended learning, and perhaps blended learning is best understood as being some combination of face-to-face and remote learning. So you've got both forms, like, of learning taking place simultaneously. About blended learning, that tends to mean two different forms of learning happening, being provided by a school at the same time. And you can imagine the circumstances in which that happens. And when you've got schools, for example, with some pupils at home, some pupils on site, then we get into the territory of blended learning. But as I said, there are lots of issues that blended learning and remote education raise. I'm just going to talk very briefly about 6 key issues that I think are most prevalent among those issues that are raised by teachers and school leaders when we think about remote and blended learning. So I want to talk about expectations. I want to talk about that first deliberately. And then I want to talk about workload, training and resources available to blended education and remote learning, the distinctions between what's known as synchronous and asynchronous learning, and we'll come on to that a bit later. Really important issues about privacy, data protection and safeguarding. And then I want to talk about teaching and the profession of teaching, pedagogy, and respecting professionalism of teachers in remote and blended learning offers. So those are 6 key points we'll touch on during this presentation. Let's start by thinking about expectations. And despite what some people say, maybe people in your school, your employer, others you may have heard, it remains the case that the evidence about what works, what's most effective with remote education and blended learning is still limited. And it's easy to understand why it's limited. We've never had, in the modern era, a global pandemic that's had the impact it's had on the education system. So no education system has been required to provide blended learning, remote education in such a short period of time, at such short notice, on such a vast scale. So the research base around blended learning, remote education is still really limited. So no one really can stand up and say one approach is indisputably better than another. Everyone is learning, and this is new for everyone. It's new for you as teachers and school leaders, certainly new for pupils, and it's new for their parents and people in their households as well. And we know some of the challenges where you've got individual people at home, some of the challenges around from your home environment, which is not your school environment, challenges that create. So everyone is learning about how this provision is best made available. And so the expectations need to be realistic. Where blended learning and remote education work best, and where perhaps had, in the view of teachers, so teachers and school leaders seeing and thinking through the impact of the offers that they're making available, where it's worked best is actually where expectations are realistic. People understand what can be made available, what can't be made available, and the fact that the approach perhaps adopted initially may turn out not to have been the best approach, and through an iterative process, we understand that there are better ways of approaching particular learning objectives and teaching in particular subjects or teaching age groups of students. So it's really important to understand that everyone is developing knowledge and understanding here, and the expectations therefore need to be realistic. One thing I think we do know, something I think we've learned from the first few months of remote education and blended learning, is that allowing teachers the time and space to share their experiences, discuss what they've been doing, how they've been working, what worked, what appeared to work, what maybe hasn't worked quite so well. That professional dialogue and exchange seems to be really fundamental to getting the best possible offer in place. So that's really important for us in terms of working with employers, working with schools, to develop the best possible offer. Allowing teachers to share their ideas with each other is a really important part of trying to get this as right as possible. So the next issue, and the issue that is raised perhaps more than any other around blended learning and remote education, is workload. Trying to do this in a sustainable way. And we know that going into the pandemic, workload was by the proverbial country mile the biggest concern that teachers and school leaders raised about the quality of their working lives. So if on top of those existing pressures, add the pressure to try and provide remote education and blended learning, you're not, I think, taking things forward in a way that is sustainable. So making sure that workload considerations are upfront and centre in the development and implementation of blended learning and remote education offers is really, really important. And again, we can learn from those employers and those schools that seem to be getting this more right than others. What are they doing right that perhaps others could learn from? And you can pick out a few features of good practice and things that we would certainly insist upon. I think the first thing, where you come across a school that's getting this right, or where conversely you encounter schools where it really doesn't seem to be sustainable, is that schools are trying to make remote education available to students without first of all addressing those very things that made workload such a problem before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know we've got pretty good understanding around what sort of practices drive excessive and unnecessary workload burdens. And those relate to factors such as marking, planning, and assessment. Now well established, there are ways in which schools can organise their marking and their planning and their assessment, their use of data in ways that are manageable for teachers and support effective teaching and learning. Where remote education is often seen as a problem, it's usually, not universally, but usually because there are poor practices that schools brought into the pandemic they are continuing. So the first stage in making sure that remote education can be offered sustainably is to attack those drivers of excessive workload. And there's lots of advice and guidance on our website about good practice in respect to marking, planning, and assessment. So the things that were being done in an unhelpful way before the pandemic, even more so now more than ever, those have to be addressed. Really important. But even if those have been addressed, remote learning is something that has just been placed onto schools as an expectation, as well as everything else they might well have done. So principle that really needs to be applied, and it's difficult for schools to do this, but they really don't have much choice. What schools need to do is make sure that remote learning is made available instead of, not as well as, other activities. So the real priorities here for schools are to make sure that they operate safely, provide some form of continuity of education, and make sure that child protection and safeguarding arrangements are in place. Those are the absolute key priorities for schools at the moment. Everything else gets in the way of that needs to be taken off the table. So you may have had schools that were thinking about implementing an initiative in other circumstances may well have been worthwhile. It might have been time consuming. It's something that schools quite legitimately might have considered. If it doesn't relate to keeping the show on the road currently, given all the pressures that schools are under, it needs to be set to one side. Schools have to be brutal in their prioritization here. Pretty much apart from those three things that I've mentioned, nothing else really matters in terms of provision of education for children. So focusing on those core priorities, of which remote learning is one, and removing everything else, even including things that in other circumstances would be worthwhile, is probably the only way that schools can do this sustainably. And again, you can point to really good practice across the system where schools have understood that and they've removed everything they possibly can to make sure that teachers can concentrate on. We need to think about workload audits as well. So before a remote learning offer is implemented, while it's being developed, thinking about what the workload implications will be for staff. Is this manageable? Is this the most streamlined and effective way in which we can make a particular form of remote learning available? Thinking really hard about the workload impact on staff of what schools are thinking about doing in that respect. And something that can really help is considering using existing specialist resources that are out there. So in England, you've got the resources provided by the Oak Academy, you've got Flow in Scotland, you've got Hub in Wales. There are resources on there which you may not find entirely to your liking professionally, and I think we understand that. Some of the resources you may think are not particularly helpful. They are a starting point, and many schools, it has to be said, find using those resources extremely helpful in making sure that the remote learning offers are sustainable. So no one, not even the people who develop those resources, say they are perfect. They're not. They're a really useful starting point. And I have to say that some of, if you take, for example, the Oak Academy resources in England, some of the schools that we've encountered seem to be having really significant workload issues around making their remote education and blended learning offers sustainable, is because they're requiring teachers and school leaders to effectively mimic the resources that are already available through the Oak Academy. So before a school thinks about developing its own resource, its own lesson plan, or it makes its own audio-visual recordings of lessons, it should think about whether they can make use of those existing resources, which are not perfect. They are a starting point, and they have been used increasingly effectively. Those responsible for providing those resources, there are others as well, but those are three I think are most prevalent. Oak in England, Flow in Scotland, the information that's provided through Flow and through Hub in Wales. They are worth considering because the key principle here is sustainability. Yes, it might not be perfect. It's a starting point. We're in difficult times and we have to make difficult decisions. Sustainability, teachers and school leaders, absolutely essential. It's not sustainable in the remote education and blended learning offer will not be something that can be sustained over a period of months. So thinking about those specialist resources, making use of them. Training and resources. A lot of teachers and school leaders have been required to use software, use learning portals. You'll all be familiar with the most frequently occurring ones across the education system. And often they've been asked to do that and they've had pretty substantial expectations made of them without any training or support. So it's really important that anyone is required to use any kind of particularly online resource that they receive support and training in its use. Again, that doesn't necessarily have to be an extensive package of support and training. Some of the best support and training is relatively brief, it's concise, but it helps begin the process of offering remote remote education. I think problems come, and workload perhaps arises as well, when too much time is spent trying to work out how the software, how the program, how the hardware should be used. So support and training up front and on an ongoing basis can actually save a lot of time in the long run, and it can also make the experience more rewarding for teachers and school leaders concerned, and also for students. It's also very important that if there is a requirement on teachers to provide remote education and blended learning, making use of IT, technology, that the equipment is provided for teachers. We really don't think it's a good idea for teachers to use their own equipment. We'll go into more detail about that in our advice and guidance, but effectively, this is something that involves your work, your professional life, and it's key that you're using equipment provided for you by your employer. So we would strongly advise not using your own equipment. Use the equipment that school provides. The school isn't providing you with the equipment to meet the expectations it's making of you. And that is something you should be raising with us. Again, touching on what we were saying earlier, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to learn from emerging evidence and good practice. This is new. We're learning all the time. Make sure that teachers have a chance to hear about different approaches, what works well, what perhaps doesn't work so well. And also training and resources, a lot of focus, and you understand why. There's a lot of focus on the use of technology. We know that there are a lot of very effective remote learning offers that aren't using technology, and you'll know the reasons why it sometimes isn't appropriate to make use of technology, particularly if the students that you're working with don't have access to technology. Problems in that respect have been very widely discussed, and quite rightly so. It's how you might use hard copy and physical resources. There are good ways of doing that that's sustainable for teachers and are effective for learners. Again, some of the existing sources of information, advice, materials we talked about a little while ago, a lot of those, if you take OAK, for example, a lot of their resources are designed in a way that allows them to be used on a hard copy basis. So the training and resources, not only around technology, also around the use of hard copy resources as well, physical resources, and we know a great part of remote education depends upon that, particularly for younger children. Another issue that comes up a lot is around, if you like, the distinction between synchronous and asynchronous learning. And by synchronous, we mean, I suppose the best way of describing it is live, something that takes place in real time. So a session such as this is live, and so live streaming would be a good example of synchronous learning. It takes place in real time. This is asynchronous learning, which, as the word suggests, doesn't take place in real time. So you have resources that a teacher might provide, develop. Those are later worked on by students, and then they might be reviewed at a different point in time by teachers. You can have asynchronous learning using technology. You can almost always you'd need asynchronous learning using physical resources. And there's a lot of emphasis in schools, and maybe you can understand why, but there's a lot of emphasis on schools. If they're leaning one way more than another, they lean towards synchronous learning rather than asynchronous learning. And it's sometimes asserted that synchronous learning, so live streaming being probably the most prevalent example, is inherently better than asynchronous learning. Maybe because it's more resemblant of live teaching in a classroom. But the fact is that currently, and again our understanding is developing on this, there really isn't any evidence that synchronous learning is any better than asynchronous learning. There is no evidence that simply because the majority of learning takes place live, that is going to have a better impact on pupils' progress and achievement than asynchronous learning. There is no evidence to support that assertion. What does seem to be important is giving pupils a chance to interact with each other. So a lot of the evidence that is available suggests that pupil interaction is really important. Obviously, there's a place for synchronous learning in providing those. Also some really good examples of pupil interaction. It doesn't have to be live, it doesn't have to be synchronous. Pupils having opportunities to understand more about what other pupils are doing really is an important part of supporting their progress and achievement. That seems to be really important. And then existing, I've said here, tailored asynchronous resources are worthy of consideration. So something you see schools really focus on, and I'll come on to this in a moment, but there's a sense in which if a teacher is in a classroom and some pupils are at home, and those pupils at home are logged on to a stream of that lesson, that is going to be innately a better experience than an asynchronous resource. There's no evidence of that at all. If you take some of the resources that are available to schools, they produce, for example, video lessons that are asynchronous, so they're recordings that are watched, produced specifically for a particular learning objective, and they are designed specifically with asynchronous learning in mind. They're watched as a recording, but they're not watched live. And a lot of work has been done on developing those resources so they are fit for purpose and they support the achievement of learning objectives. So rather than always thinking that live synchronous learning is innately better, sometimes using dedicated, tailored resources that have had a lot of money, a lot of research and underpinning them in their development, they are well worthy of consideration. Often a learning objective can be achieved just as well by watching a recording that's been obtained from an external source than watching a live streamed lesson. Remember what we said, there's no evidence that one is necessarily better than the other. And the key point is that the approach should fit learning objectives. So the learning objective is key, and then it's which approach best suits the achievement of this learning objective. Where practice is less good, it's kind of the other way around. So the starting point in less good practice is to start with synchronous learning, live streaming, and then think, what could we teach using synchronous learning? Because that's, the assumption is erroneously that is the best approach. It's always best to start with a learning objective and then think about the ways in which that learning objective can be achieved. Practice tend, in our experience thus far, tends to start with learning objectives and thinking about their approaches. And if you think about it, in terms of your day-to-day classroom teaching, that's how you would plan. Start with the learning objective, and then you think about what is the best way to achieve this learning objective. That's a core principle of good pedagogy. It shouldn't be departed from when we're talking about remote education and blended learning. Let's talk a little bit about live streaming as well, because this is something that I think does create some concern and some questions about whether it's appropriate or not, and what does it mean. But it can take, excuse me, it can take various forms. So we can begin by thinking about a case we talked about a little while ago, which is live video to pupils in their home. So a teacher who may be at school, maybe in the early part of the at home, they are streaming a lesson live to pupils who are watching it on a device in their home. Is that acceptable? Well, if you go on our website, there is a checklist that you can use to think through whether it's appropriate or not to make use of live streaming in that form. The really key thing that we would say is that ultimately no one should be forced to use live streaming. So the first point is that the use of live streaming in this form should be about the professional judgment of the teacher. And it should also take into account before it's used, about some of the risks, and there are risks with live streaming. So it creates data protection issues, particularly if it's recorded. We'll be recording in a moment. But there are issues about privacy, safeguarding, particularly, and this is a practice that I think is very difficult for us to enforce. A practice where you've got a lesson being taught live by a teacher in a classroom, some pupils watching that lesson from home. If you think about it in terms of privacy, data protection, that raises a wide range of issues. You've got teachers and individual children, their participation in a lesson being broadcast into the home of other children. And we talk about, and it's important, for example, the record function can be disabled. But we know from some of the cases we've dealt with, it's because the system has a disableable record function, so the pupil at home can't record what they see, doesn't mean that the images can't be captured in some way. There are ways in which that can be addressed. They must be addressed. In any set of circumstances, if you think about the idea of teachers and pupils, if you think about it from the pupil's perspective, you're the parent of a pupil, you're the parent of a pupil, and that pupil is in a classroom, and they're learning in a classroom, and they're learning, their participation, their activities in the classroom are being live streamed into another child's home, where you don't know who is watching what's going on in that classroom. You can see the data protection issues. You can see parents of children in school objecting very strongly to that, and you might understand why. So that is a particularly difficult area. So our advice is generally that we should exercise caution in the use of live streaming and consider all other options first. So that goes back to what I was saying about the different approaches that schools can think about, particularly some of the asynchronous approaches and the use of existing resources. Really important to do that. Also, one of the options that is available, and again, I've seen this and encountered this being used very effectively, is you can have synchronous learning that doesn't have video. You can use chat functions. To some extent, audio might be a helpful alternative approach. It doesn't have to be live streaming of video. And remember, there is no evidence that this approach is any more effective than any other type of approach that might be adopted. So really thinking about that, we would say exercise caution about any live streaming. Think about the learning objective, and is there another way in which this learning objective could be met without necessarily making use of live streaming. The other practice that's become prevalent as the pandemic has gone on is, if you like, the teacher being at home because they're self-isolating, or given permission to work from home, and the pupils are in school. And again, that has some important data protection issues, but in our view, it's not objectionable in principle. So again, on our website, you will see there's advice and guidance about how that could be established on an acceptable basis, but it is not acceptable. And actually, in some circumstances, it's a way in which teachers who we would say really shouldn't be in school, because maybe they're extremely clinically vulnerable, maybe they're teachers in the later stages of pregnancy, or our view is that those individual teachers are probably safer at home than they are attending school. This is a way in which they can continue to work. There are important caveats that need to be added to that. So the pupils who are in the school, they've got to be supervised. That's really important. I've come across one or two cases that have been reported to us where schoolers thought they can establish live video from the teacher at home, the pupils at school, without the pupils in the classroom being supervised. And that went as badly as you would imagine that it did. It's really important that pupils in school, pupils in the classroom, are supervised. And again, the feedback we've got from members who've been involved in that practice is that if that happens, it can work really well. However, it doesn't work well if the workload demands aren't addressed appropriately. That is quite demanding. So it is important when schools are thinking about establishing those arrangements, they understand that in many respects, the workload demands in setting that up and teaching in that way can be even more demanding than teaching in a classroom. So it is really a really significant issue around workload. It can be managed. So the feedback we've got is that it can be managed appropriately. It is something that needs to be thought about very carefully. And then schools need to think about some of the alternatives that they have in those circumstances. So some schools have said teaching in that way isn't something they want to consider, and if a teacher isn't available, they will provide supply cover. There are approaches to blended curricula that might work quite effectively there. Obviously, from our point of view, one approach we would not accept is teachers in school covering the lessons of absent colleagues. Teachers' terms and conditions of employment, their contracts have not changed as a result of this. Teachers really shouldn't be routinely providing cover, they should only cover rarely. So that is an approach. Again, it's synchronous, it's live video, it's the teacher at home, it's pupils in school. It can work, but only if some of the key criteria and safeguards are in place. And then that brings us on to really key issues about privacy, excuse me, data protection and safeguarding. So from our point of view, lessons absolutely should not be recorded, because if a school records the lesson, and it gives itself a whole range of complex data protection obligations, because that is data under the GDPR regulations, and then schools have to manage that data in a way that respects the data protection rights of every single person whose data is captured through recording of lessons. So we don't think there is any meaningful case for recording live learning. So we say there should always be at least 2 members of staff present. One of the criteria we would apply in live streaming should always be 2 members of staff present in any live streaming session. So take the example of the teacher working from home, classroom, there should always be another adult supervising the people there. Some schools would say they want to record sessions in case any problems arise, but wouldn't routinely record teaching in a classroom. We would oppose that very strongly for data protection and privacy reasons. As long as there are 2 adults there, then there really shouldn't be any problem. So we would object very strongly to any practice in which the lessons that are provided using technology are recorded, particularly live lessons. There is a practice, just to apart from that slightly, where what teachers are often asked to do currently is asynchronous, looking at recordings of lessons. So recordings not necessarily of lessons in classroom, teachers recording maybe their exposition, their explanation of a teaching objective, recording that and making that available to students to view remotely and asynchronously. That's a different matter in that respect, although again, the recording itself, recording of a dedicated set piece to camera is data, and that data needs to be handled appropriately, but you can see that the context is different. But what I would say to any school that's contemplating doing that is there a resource available to you externally that you could use that's been recorded especially for that purpose, that could be used instead of the teacher having to spend their time recording a video to be shown to pupils at home. It's a workload issue as much as anything else. Absolutely, live streaming where it is used, live lessons should not be recorded. And then live streaming to pupils' homes, again, it's a really important issue. Key criteria, absolute minimum expectations as far as we're concerned is, can recordings be prevented? What about parents? And how would parents be expected to conduct themselves if live streaming is taking place into pupils' homes? That's really important. I'll come to their behaviour in a second. Seeking permission from parents is absolutely key. If you're talking about blended learning context, if the school is capturing data through its recording or its live streaming of lessons and involve individual pupils, and that can't be stored as data without explicit permission of parents of those pupils. You can see how complicated complying with data protection regulations is in the context of live streaming, where each individual pupil and their parent has really significant data protection rights. That's why we would always say try and avoid any approach that creates data protection obligations. Those rights are important. Actually, schools make their lives much more difficult for themselves than if they were to use existing resources that carry no such data protection issues and are actually designed purposes for which school loan provision often intended. And the point about making sure that at least 2 members of staff are present. Really key advice from us is that if you're talking about individual one-to-one contact with a pupil live, so a one-to-one session with a pupil, we would say that is highly problematic and we would advise against it for all kinds of obvious safeguarding and data protection reasons. And schools sometimes insist that teachers, perhaps this was maybe more of an issue early on in the lockdown when only some schools, most pupils were at home. There was an expectation in some schools that teachers would conduct periodic one-to-one sessions, counselling sessions, discussion sessions, pastoral sessions with individual pupils using Zoom. Obviously, that is very ill-advised. We would be very clear in our advice that that shouldn't happen, and we will challenge any employer that insists that teachers undertake such sessions. They do create risks, they're really not sensible, and we would advise very strongly. And then the final point I just want to touch on is around, if you like, pedagogy and professionalism, the role of the teacher in the provision of remote education and blended learning. Really telling, I think, really significant. So when the pandemic first hit the education system back in late March, there was suddenly an expectation, no resources, no research, no evidence, no experience providing remote education on a massive scale. And it is amazing, and it's a testament to the professionalism of teachers with no resources, no support, no real external expertise on which to draw. Teachers and school leaders were able to establish and then implement and maintain really effective learning offers. I think the feedback from parents and from pupils in that early stage of the lockdown was that they felt generally that schools were really providing rewarding, broad, engaging learning offers pretty much from scratch. You have to ask, how come schools were able to do that? How come they're able to respond so quickly, so flexibly, so effectively to an immediate crisis? 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks before lockdown, no one really was thinking about having to provide remote learning. 2 weeks later, it was the core focus of teachers and school leaders in schools. How was that possible? We would argue it was possible because in some respects, schools, employers, and the education system had no choice but to trust teachers, use their skill and their expertise and their knowledge to develop these offers and then make them available to students. So it put teacher professionalism, teacher discretion in the driving seat. That's why it was so effective. There weren't lots of bureaucratic hoops to jump through. There wasn't overbearing in most cases, but there were exceptions. In most cases, there wasn't overbearing scrutiny, oversight. There weren't drop-ins. There weren't learning walks. All of that couldn't work because this was new. Teachers were trusted to develop learning offers, and they did a magnificent job. So if we've learned one thing from the lockdown and the restrictions placed on the operation of schools, is that if you trust teachers to use their professionalism and their judgment, if you trust teachers and school leaders as the people who know their pupils best, they will deliver the best possible learning experiences for children. Really key message. And so teachers have to be in the driving seat for developing this practice. A few lessons again that I think have emerged from the last few months. And I think one of the key lessons, particularly where practice isn't as effective as we would like, and sometimes particularly where it's very workload intensive, is that what some schools tried to do is just take their existing practices, their materials, their policies, all of which were designed for classroom teaching in the physical realm, as it were, just try and copy and paste them into remote learning. That generally doesn't work. It's unwieldy and it's not effective. Remote learning blended learning is new, it's distinctive, it's not the same as classroom teaching. I think we would argue, and I think most teachers would agree, it's not as effective as classroom teaching. I think even the government would agree that that is that expectation. It's different. We're just trying to take everything that was expected of teachers in a classroom and try and digitize it and put it in a remote and blended learning offer. Doesn't work. It has to be tailored. That's why, because teachers tailored those resources, they amended them and adapted them for remote learning. That's why it was so effective. That's why in extraordinarily challenging circumstances, teachers and school leaders. It's also thinking about that leads us to think about some of the less helpful practices we see in classrooms in normal times, so to speak. Some schools have tried to replicate in respect of remote learning. So we've seen schools trying to have learning observations, drop-ins, learning walks, and try and take those and apply them in the context of remote and blended learning. They're not necessary and they're not helpful, because to some extent we're not really learning an awful lot about what a teacher can do in a real classroom context by trying to observe, monitor and scrutinize their practice when they're engaged in remote and blended learning. And making sure teachers can focus on teaching and learning, focus on trying to get to grips with the difficult task of remote education and blended learning does not help by schools trying to impose particularly overbearing and unwieldy, and in some cases punitive, scrutiny and monitoring practices to try and translate that into the kind of remote learning arena. Much better to support teachers to try and deal with what is a really difficult problem. So it's the support rather than the scrutiny, monitoring and oversight needs to be upfront and centre. Another really important point, again, that comes back from members' feedback, is that schools often, and unfortunately this is changing, often have policies and procedures around assessment that are incredibly data driven. So we see data drops, see the collection of data, we see flight paths, we see a lot of teaching and learning revolving around data and around value-added systems, and you're all familiar with those kind of practices, which again in normal times are incredibly unhelpful. See our website for some exploration of that. Data-driven teaching and learning is generally not effective, time-consuming, distracts from focusing on learning needs of pupils. And we need to move away from that towards, if you like, more formative assessment. This is an iterative process, everyone is learning, and we're trying to work out what impact types of remote learning have on pupils' progress. Lends itself more to a formative approach and a summative approach. So schools that are locked into the use of data, which is bad enough at the best of times, still trying to conduct data-driven assessment within schools, are getting in the way of remote and blended learning. They're not really supporting it. So focusing on formative rather than summative assessment is really key. The other point, the behaviour of parents during live sessions. So we have seen, for example, cases where parents have conducted a running commentary on the teaching during a live session. That's entirely inappropriate for obvious reasons. If schools are going to use some form of live provision, and as a minimum expectation, expectations of behaviour of parents during those sessions is really key. And you can see how, again, if you've got a live teaching session, different students taking part in that session, and you've got a parent observing not only their child's participation, but participation of other children, you can see the privacy issues that arise. So again, that's one of the reasons why we would say think very, very carefully about whether live sessions are most appropriate. Depth and balance is important, really important in terms of having kind of remote learning offer that I think is going to be most worthwhile to students. But it's really important, this goes back to expectations, that because of the nature of remote, obviously some parts of the curriculum that is very, very hard to deliver in a way that relies upon remote education and blended learning. So having a realistic set of expectations about what can be provided and what can't is incredibly important. Pupil behaviour is really key. Just because we're talking about remote education, we're talking about blended learning, we are not necessarily in typical circumstances. From our point of view, that doesn't mean standards and respect behaviour should be reduced. Some pupils, and we all understand this, because of the difficulty and the challenges current times create for many children and people, they may need, and I think this is widely recognised, really important, some children may need more help and more support to meet those expected standards of behaviour. That does not mean that those standards themselves should become. Behaviour is really important. Behaviour, good behaviour, good discipline is integral to effective learning in any context, including a blended education and remote education context as well. And we shouldn't see teachers spending all their time chasing up pupils who are not engaging in remote education. Schools will want to do everything they possibly can to ensure that pupils are engaging in remote education. The teachers should not be spending, given all the pressures they're under, teachers should not be spending hours chasing up pupils who are not engaging in remote education. They certainly should flag that up internally in a school. Schools need to develop systems and structures to help recognise that there may be some pupils who aren't engaging in remote education, and then trying to support those pupils as effectively as possible in really difficult circumstances, being clear about what can be expected. Teachers should not, after a difficult day trying to deliver remote education and blended learning, and then be spending even more time on top of that day chasing up pupils who are not engaging in remote education sessions. Workload demands are significant and substantial enough as they are without adding that top. If it's not sustainable, teachers will not be in a position to maintain learning offers for an extended period of time. So that was a very brief run through advice and guidance that we have produced. There's a lot more questions that I could have answered if I'd had more time, but I just wanted to pick out some of the come up more often than others. As I say, on the website for the advice and guidance, we're continuing to update that advice and guidance, so keep an eye on that. If you have an issue about your own circumstances personally, something that's concerning you related to remote education and blended learning, then we're available and here to help you. Email address there, but it's very easily found on our website for our member support advice team. And also, if there's practice across an employer that is inappropriate, needs to be challenged, we will challenge it. We are challenging employers that aren't abiding by our minimum expectations around remote and blended learning, around workload and working conditions generally. We will challenge poor behaviour. So if your employer is not acting appropriately on all of these issues, really, really important that you tell us about it so we can represent your interests and the interests of fellow NASUWT members in your school and with your employers. And finally, to make the point that I think is absolutely critical to making sure that you are supported, is that the advice and guidance that we are able to produce that supports you in your school is all based around feedback that we receive from members. So the advice and guidance we produce, what we want it to do is address real life practical issues that arise in school. So the feedback we get from members is absolutely vital. So you need to share with us, and there are lots of ways in which you can share your feedback with the NASUWT, with your local association. That's the best way of doing it. Share it with your national executive member, write to the union nationally if that's the best approach for you. Speak to your school rep. There are lots of ways in which you can feedback your experiences about what the problems are you're facing, but equally as important, what works well. We're able to point to better practice because we've got people in schools who have been able to tell us about what works well in their classroom, and we're able to disseminate that. Makes a really big difference in the quality of our advice. But I'm going to, because my PowerPoint has stopped there, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass back to Paul.
Sorry, Darren, I was muted. Can I say thank you very much for that? I note that there have been a number of questions in the box for attendees this evening. Firstly, can I just say a very, very big thank you for doing the work this evening on this and eloquently explaining the strengths and weaknesses and the pitfalls, numerous though they are, of blended learning and remote learning. I think particularly looking at the chat box for people who use their own equipment, or the expectation on people to use their own equipment, which I have to say is unacceptable and is pitted with lots of problems, and it's a minefield. I having dealt with a number of employers, as I do in my role within the NASUWT, I find that very at odds with what is current thinking from employers. Employers are actually ahead of the game on this and are very reticent for people to use their own equipment in any shape or form and to take things home in any shape or form, in the sense of transferring from a USB stick you have at home to a USB stick you have at work. A lot of use of the cloud instead is being promoted. So I think it's Rona. I find your comment about the expectation your school has regarding the use of your own equipment on a regular basis, and also this idea we're not going to provide you with a computer to undertake work for us in the sense of a parents' evening, is, I think, unacceptable. Bottom line is, if you have to be on the end of a phone, socially distanced at a school to talk to parents over a phone where you are all socially distanced, if that's the way it has to be, it's the way it has to be. You should not be expected to undertake this with your own equipment, because there are devices that allow people to access your phone number even though you hide it. We've been very aware of that. So I think this practice you need to robustly push back and talk to your local NASUWT colleagues about this, because that is unacceptable practice in my eyes and should be challenged robustly. But obviously I think we've answered the questions, and if you do have any more questions, then do come back to us with the information that Darren's pointed out in the presentation, the email address, and we will obviously challenge those things and take them further. And it only is left for me now to say thank you very much to colleagues like Darren and Sonia for being in on this, and thank you very much for your attendance this evening. I hope you found it as useful as I did, and obviously do keep abreast of further developments from the NASUWT and further advice and guidance that may be coming out in the future regarding this, because as we appreciate, it is a dynamic and fluid and a constantly evolving piece in this area. So thank you very much for your time this evening, and do take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.